Good morning. The subcommittee will come to order. The subcommittee is convening today to examine the fatal sinking of the U.S. flagged cargo ship SS Faro, and on a second panel, the Coast Guard's failed efforts to implement electronic health record system. On October 1st, 2015, the 790-foot U.S. flagged cargo ship SS Faro sank in the Atlantic Ocean about 40 nautical miles northeast of Acklands and Crooked Island, Bahamas. An unusual storm path, reliance on outdated weather reports, and failure to implement proper bridge resource management techniques resulted in Faro sailing almost directly into Hurricane Joaquin, a Category 4 storm with an estimated sustained wind speed of 115 knots. The loss of the U.S. flagged cargo vessel Faro, along with its 33-member crew, ranks as one of the worst maritime disasters in U.S. history and resulted in the highest death toll from a U.S. commercial vessel sinking in almost 40 years. The last comparable U.S. maritime disaster was the sinking of the U.S. bulk carrier Marine Electric off the coast of Virginia in February 1983, in which all but 3 of the 34 persons aboard lost their lives. The Coast Guard instituted major changes following that tragedy to improve safety and prevent similar events from occurring in the future. Despite those efforts to improve safety, a tragedy befell the Faro. On October 31st, 2015, a U.S. Navy vessel located in the main wreckage of Faro and the vessel's voyage data recorder was successfully recovered. It contained 26 hours of bridge audio recordings and other critical navigation data that were used by the Coast Guard and the Ntsb investigators to understand the causes of this horrible incident and develop recommendations to prevent future tragedies. The Coast Guard Marine Board of Investigation made 31 safety and 4 administrative recommendations to address the causes of the Faro sinking. In December 2017, the Commandant of the Coast Guard released his final action memo on the Marine Board's recommendation. The Commandant concurred with 29 of 31 safety recommendations and 3 of 4 administrative recommendations. The National Transportation Safety Board launched an investigation as soon as the sinking of Faro was confirmed, ultimately providing numerous recommendations for responsible entities, including the Coast Guard, the International Association of Classification Societies, and the owner of Faro. The nation relies on our merchant mariners and the U.S. flagged ships they sail. It is critical that policies are in place and adopted as standard practice to ensure mariners' safety. In order to do so, we must learn from the loss of the Faro. I look forward to discussing how this tragedy occurred and what steps are being taken to prevent another such incident from occurring. Notwithstanding the importance and gravity of the Faro tragedy, on Panel 2 we will examine the Coast Guard's apparent inability to implement an electronic health record system to manage data for its only 56,000 Coast Guard members and retirees. After wasting more than $66 million over a 5-year period, the Coast Guard canceled its electronic health records effort, referred to as the Integrated Health Information System Project. The service has nothing to show for the time and money expended and finds itself in a worse position than before it awarded the first contract almost 8 years ago. Today, the Coast Guard is still handling all medical information using paper records, records that cannot be shared with the Department of Defense or the Veterans Affairs system. Following a subcommittee request to review Coast Guard actions, the Government Accountability Office found that for nearly the entire span of the project, the Coast Guard allowed program managers to act without sufficient oversight by acquisition professionals. Even when the Coast Guard established its non-major acquisition process policies to provide oversight for information technology acquisitions, things like the Integrated Health Information System Project, they did not implement any oversight. Despite chartering several oversight bodies for the project, GAO found that the Coast Guard, quote, could not provide evidence that the boards had ever been active in overseeing the project prior to its cancellation, end quote. Other than realizing they had been throwing away good money for years, the Coast Guard still cannot provide a solid explanation as to why it canceled the Integrated Health Information System Project. The Coast Guard needs to show what it's learned and how things have changed as it works to finally implement an electronic health record system. We understand the service is following its acquisition policies for the current effort and has conducted significant research which pointed to a recommended solution of using an existing federal agency system. That's amazing. After a 5-year epic failure, these are positive steps. However, we need to hear more about the policies and procedures that are now in place to prevent the waste of taxpayer money in the future. I look forward to discussing how this debacle occurred, what steps the Coast Guard is taking to ensure nothing like this can happen again, and where the Coast Guard is in the process of finally acquiring an electronic health record system. I thank the witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to hearing all the various testimony on the various issues, and I yield to Ranking Member Garamendi, recognized. Yield to the Ranking Member of the full committee, Mr. DeFazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the Ranking Member for that. I have to run to a press event, and then I'll be back. I consider this, first off, I'm concerned that we're merging 2 totally unrelated subjects here. Certainly the acquisition failure is important. Whether it merits a hearing or not, I'm not sure, but it certainly shouldn't be taking away from a focus on the El Faro tragedy. This was totally preventable. And I think there are a number of factors and things that require the attention of the subcommittee. First off, there's real questions about the Coast Guard's, whether their budget is adequate to carry out this very, very important function. I think it's not. I think we've spread them too thin, and they are relying far too much on classification societies without any substantial oversight of those classification societies. And from some in the industry, I understand there's classification. There are companies who do a good job, and there are other companies, if you pay them, they will certify your rust bucket as seaworthy. Now, that's just not right. And that really requires some scrutiny. It also requires us to question how we got to that point and what we can do to rectify that. I think that the Coast Guard should have resources adequate to minimally to oversee these classification societies. Perhaps we need to have some sort of a system where we either certify them or decertify them for U.S. certification. Now they can go to these non-existent countries with these registries and certify rust buckets. We can't control that, but we can control whose certifications we accept here in the United States of America. And that, I think, played a substantial role in this, plus real questions about, obviously, the management of tote and the training that tote provided, the adequacy of the life-saving supplies on the ship, all the questions about when the ship had a major conversion, why it wasn't considered a major conversion, and therefore they didn't have to upgrade things, what brought that about, which might have saved lives in this case. There's just a host of questions. And I hope we can really drill down on that, and I hope we don't get distracted with the second panel. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the ranking member. And we don't, from what I understand too, it's hard to get committee time because we won't do in this full committee multiple subcommittees at the same time. So we don't do freeways and Coast Guard, which enables the ranking member and others to attend. But we're out of days for stuff. So we're going to focus for the first hour on the El Faro, or however long it takes us before we move on. Mr. Garamendi, you're recognized for your opening statement.
Let's get on with the hearing. If, without objection, my testimony be in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
And I think I'll just let it go at that with a couple of very brief statements. It was 35 years ago that the Marine Board of Investigation made a report about the faults of two systems in the maritime safety programs. Here we are again, essentially the same report being issued, this time on the El Faro situation. The question is, why are we back with the same recommendations to address the tragedy of the El Faro? Bottom line is, why didn't we get it right in the last 35 years? With that, my testimony, my written, will be in the record.
Thank the gentleman. I ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions. Without objection, so ordered. On the first panel, we will hear from Rear Admiral John Netto, Assistant Commandant for Prevention Policy for the United States Coast Guard, and the Honorable Earl Weiner, member of the National Transportation Safety Board, accompanied by Mr. Brian Curtis, Director of the Office of Marine Safety for the Ntsb. Admiral Netto, you're recognized to give your statement, and welcome back.
Good morning, Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garamendi, distinguished members of the subcommittee. I'm honored to be here today. Mr. Chairman, I want to especially thank you for your leadership and enduring support to the Coast Guard. On behalf of all the men and women in the Coast Guard, I offer our deepest condolences to the families of the 33 mariners lost on board El Faro. As our Commandant noted in the final action memo, the loss of the El Faro and everyone aboard was a tragic and preventable accident. This is a call to action for the entire maritime community. The Commandant is committed to making improvements within the Coast Guard and the maritime industry, and has directed me to do so. The Marine Board of Investigation conducted an exhaustive 2-year investigation in full view of the public. While the primary cause of the casualty was the decision to navigate El Faro too close to the path of Hurricane Joaquin, there were other contributing factors. These include, 1, the failure of Tote Services Incorporated to maintain an effective safety management system. 2, the failure of the ship's classification society, ABS, on multiple occasions to uncover or otherwise resolve long-standing deficiencies that adversely affected the safety and seaworthiness of vessels. And 3, failure of the Coast Guard to properly oversee the work conducted by ABS on our behalf. To determine if these issues revealed in the Faro investigation are pervasive throughout the fleet, I directed a team of senior marine inspectors to closely examine more ships currently enrolled in the Alternate Compliance Program, or ACP. We have found additional evidence of breakdowns in the safety framework, and our findings confirm concerns raised in the investigation about the material condition of several other U.S. flag vessels. All elements of the safety framework, the vessel owners and operators, the class societies, and the Coast Guard, must all improve. The vessel owner is accountable for properly maintaining and ensuring the safe operations of the vessel. The class society plays a key role in ensuring safety by providing thorough and accurate surveys and compelling corrective actions when needed. The Coast Guard is the final element in the safety framework by verifying compliance with mandatory safety standards. As was noted in the Federal Register announcing the program more than 2 decades ago, ACP was created in response to the needs expressed by the U.S. maritime industry to reduce the regulatory burden and alleviate duplication of effort between the Coast Guard and class societies. Since day one, the Coast Guard has committed to providing oversight to ensure that vessels participating in ACP are maintained and operated to the same level of safety as vessels inspected by the Coast Guard under the traditional process. Today, we remain committed to this goal and acknowledge we must do better. The U.S., like other flag states around the globe today, now relies far more heavily on third parties than ever before. In fact, the vast majority of the U.S. Sea Lift fleet that DoD relies on to transport America's soldiers, Marines, and their equipment overseas uses class societies for many of their compliance activities. Now, more than ever, we need to get this right. The Coast Guard must and will restore the safety framework with robust and thorough oversight and accountability. I am taking a number of steps to do so. I will lead the actions directed by the Commandant in response to this tragedy. I am reforming our oversight program and directing changes to the organization, the procedures, the policy, the training, and the capture and management of key information. These actions are needed to ensure accountability for the maritime industry, the authorized class societies, and the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard has the authority and the competency needed to successfully accomplish this. As I pursue these actions, I will be transparent and keep you all informed. At the end of the day, this is about the lives of the men and women who go to sea in support of the nation's economic prosperity, in support of our military readiness, and in support of our national security. I recently had the opportunity to visit the Faro Memorial in Jacksonville. I also met some of the mariners who had once sailed on the Faro and now mourn the loss of their shipmates. It was a moving and humbling experience. This tragedy has shined a spotlight on failures of the safety framework. We must honor the 33 lost mariners with a strong bias towards action. The Coast Guard, after the vessel owner and the class society, is the final element in the safety framework responsible for ensuring compliance with mandated safety standards. The Coast Guard must and will restore the safety framework. Again, thank you for your strong support of the Coast Guard. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I ask my written statement be entered in the record. I look forward to your questions.
Without objection, thank you, Admiral. Mr. Weiner, you're recognized.
Good morning, Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garamendi, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting the Ntsb to provide testimony today.
Would you mind pulling the microphone a bit closer to you? Thank you.
I'm accompanied by Brian Curtis, the Director of our Office of Marine Safety. My testimony will discuss the Ntsb's investigation into the sinking of the cargo ship Faro and the loss of all 33 crew members aboard. The Ntsb-led investigation was a joint effort with the United States Coast Guard. 4 days after the sinking, the Ntsb, Coast Guard, and many other organizations began a collaborative search of the ocean floor, seeking the El Faro wreckage and in an effort to locate and retrieve the ship's voyage data recorder, or VDR. Data recorders are important investigative tools critical to many of our investigations. It took 3 missions to recover the VDR. Analysis revealed significant data, including 26 hours of audio, which was crucial in determining the probable cause of El Faro's sinking. On September 29th, 2015, at 9:48 p.m., the El Faro and its crew departed Jacksonville, Florida for San Juan, Puerto Rico. Operated by Tote Services, the U.S. flagship was slated to arrive in the early morning hours of October 2nd. However, rather than routing around the approaching storm, the ship sailed directly...
Mr. Wien, I'm sorry, there is wind going through here, and I have bad ears. Do you mind pulling that thing really close? Please, and speak louder if you could. There's like wind blowing through here behind us, and I've got artillery ears.
On September 29th, 2015, at 9:48 p.m., the El Faro and its crew departed Jacksonville, Florida for San Juan, Puerto Rico. Operated by Tote Services, the U.S. flagship was slated to arrive in the early morning hours of October 2nd. However, rather than routing around the approaching storm, the ship sailed directly into the path of the hurricane and sank at approximately 8 a.m. on October 1st. My written testimony provides more detail regarding what happened during the voyage that led to the ship's being in harm's way. For now, I will focus on major safety issues identified in our report. The NTSB's probable cause determination for this accident included the captain's decision-making and actions, which put the El Faro and its crew in peril. The captain did not divert to safer routes to avoid Joaquin, failing to heed junior officers who suggested an alternate course was necessary to avoid the hurricane. We found that although the El Faro received sufficient weather information to facilitate appropriate decision-making by the captain regarding the vessel's route, the captain did not use the most current weather information available to him. In addition, the investigation revealed the captain's light regard for crew's suggestions and the crew's lack of assertiveness in stating their concerns to the captain. The NTSB found that the bridge crew did not use all available resources nor act effectively as a team to safely operate the ship. The El Faro, sailing on a collision course with Hurricane Joaquin, was further imperiled by the failure to maintain the ship's watertight integrity. Seawater entered a cargo hold through an open scuttle. The resulting flooding caused improperly secured automobiles to impact an inadequately protected fire pump supplied by piping carrying seawater. The damaged piping allowed seawater to flow unchecked into the ship. This exacerbated other flooding causes caused by water entering through open, unsecured ventilation closures. In addition, the tote's safety management system was inadequate. Its lack of oversight in critical aspects of safety management denoted a weak safety culture in the company and contributed to the sinking of the El Faro. Finally, the captain's decisions to muster the crew and abandon the ship were late and likely reduced the crew's chance of survival. The severe weather, combined with El Faro's list, made it unlikely that life rafts or lifeboats available on the ship could be launched or boarded by crew members once in the water. The lifeboats on board would not have provided adequate protection even if they had been launched. Coast Guard standards do not require older ships such as the El Faro to adhere to the latest safety standards. These were just a few of the issues identified out of a total of 81 findings and 53 safety recommendations. As with all investigations, our aim is to learn from this tragedy to prevent similar events from occurring again. We believe that the adoption of our recommendations will help improve safety for current and future generations of mariners. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Curtis, you're recognized. Okay, you're just accompanying. So I'll start out by recognizing myself. Thank you very much for being here. My question is pretty simple. If they would have closed the hatches of the ventilation systems, right, so the water could not get in the high sea states that they had, would they have been okay? If their engines would not have failed and they hadn't taken on water, could they have sailed through?
I think our investigation showed that this was a series of events, a chain of events that had been interrupted at any point, the chain would not have been completed. So it started with a decision to not avoid the hurricane. Once they got into heavy weather, they had a scuttle that got flooding in one of the holes.
When you say an open scuttle, that's, what is that? Will you tell the committee what that is?
That's a hatch going between decks that is ordinarily, for heavy weather, should have been closed and locked, but it was left open. So they got down flooding with that. Basically, there was a whole series of events.
Mr. Curtis, Admiral?
Sir, I would add to that, the Coast Guard's perspective, I think it's difficult to say. It's hard to simplify it to that level. It is a series of events that go on, a chain of events that occurred, and I think it would be very difficult for us to say with any degree of certainty whether or not simply closing vents would have prevented this casualty.
What I'm trying to get at is you have all of these recommendations, right? And you can go through a ship or an airplane or anything, military or civilian, and say this isn't up to code, or this is unsatisfactory, or we're going to allow this to slide because of the age of the vessel or the aircraft or whatever. But what I'm trying to get at is if all of those things were followed, then the right decisions would have been made in the first place, and the chain of events would not have happened. But it's not like the ship broke in half because the weld wasn't right or something, or it didn't pass, or it passed an inspection where it failed on the structure of the ship. It was decision making and not paying attention to detail that caused the initial stuff, right? I mean, the captain sailed into the hurricane, not around it, and they had basically open hatches on the ship that allowed water to get in, and then boom, right? That started the really fast chain of events, I'm guessing. Is that correct, roughly?
Sir, our investigation concluded that likely the material condition of the ship did contribute as well, and that the watertight fittings that would be relied upon to prevent progressive flooding were not in a condition they should have been maintained.
Gotcha. Mr. Curtis?
Certainly, as you point out, that was a significant event in the series of events, having the hatch open, and our report made recommendations to that very point to hopefully prohibit it from happening in the future, with having alarms and notifications if a hatch is left open, then it should be closed. But it was, as you said, a significant
This sounds, I mean, to me, you had, when I was in Fallujah, you had M1 Abrams tanks every now and then would roll over into ravines, and the Marines would die. They would go over into irrigation canals, right? It wasn't anything wrong with the tank. It was, I mean, they might have had some things that weren't up to code, but it is wartime. But there wasn't anything wrong with the tank, but they changed how they drove around irrigation canals. And I would guess that that's a lot of your recommendations is say, do this next time, don't do that, right?
certainly in our report, yes, sir.
Sir, I'd only add, during this investigation, we went aboard the sister vessel, the El Yunque, which was in similar service, similar build date, maintained by the same company, and that ship ended up being scrapped after we went on board based on the material condition.
And Tote was in the process of rebuilding these, or building the new class of these anyway, right? As this happened, this ship, the El Faro, was going to be pulled out of the line, I would assume in the next couple, or now, right, if it had stayed afloat.
Sir, I believe the intent was to shift the El Faro to the northwest so that it would go into trade back and forth to Alaska while they were still working to deliver the final 2 new container ships that were being built.
Thank you. Mr. Garimoto, you recognize.
I'm not going to spend a lot of time focusing on the mistakes made by the captain and the crew along the way. Those are well documented in the report. Going forward, the utility of the National Transportation Safety Board report and the Coast Guard is really where I want to focus here. How can we prevent this kind of accident from occurring again? So to the Coast Guard, who has oversight of the safety of ships and the associations that are specifically responsible for reviewing a ship, what are you doing to assure us that the various associations and organizations that review the safeties of ships is actually taking place and is robust enough to assure that the ship is safe? And then there's a series of questions about the competency of the men and women on the ship. So first, what are you doing to assure us that the organizations that review the safety of the ships actually do their job?
Ranking Member Garamendi, for starters, we wanted to see how pervasive these conditions were throughout the fleet, so I have a team out visiting what we would view to be the high-risk vessels that are enrolled in ACP, based on their age, based on their history, based on their casualties, et cetera. And the findings indicate that it is not unique to the El Faro. We have other ships out there that are in substandard condition. We have moved out to reform our oversight program. It starts with governance and having the proper people in place with the proper focus to call attention and hold others accountable. That also involves having the right policy and procedures in place, the right information management systems to capture the data, collect it, and then engage with our third parties and communicate to hold them accountable. So it's an ongoing effort. It'll take us a little time, but we have launched and we're underway and committed to rectifying the problems that we're finding.
Do you have a tracking system, a review system in place so that you know what is actually taking place as you attempt to improve your oversight?
We have a called MISSIL. It's an information management system we use for all of our marine safety activities and others. It has not been able to capture some of the information we wanted to capture, so we are making changes now to improve that system. At this time, it is difficult for our people in the field, when they do find things, to properly incorporate it into MISSIL so we can roll up all that data, all that information, and then engage with our third parties to talk to them about the problems we're finding. Changes are underway, so we'll have that capability and be able to make sure we have the information to engage with them.
So there's a reporting system that has not worked well in the past. When your people in the field find something is amiss, it just no reporting up the chain of command, and then no action by the chain of command. Is that what has happened in the past?
The procedures, the processes, the training, and the information capture all need to be improved.
Well, we're towards the end of January here, and I suppose you have a tracking system in place so that you know that there are improvements underway?
We do, sir. We are working. I have a team assembled that's working on this, and we have moved out to actually look at the ships. So I guess there's a couple efforts. One, again, is in the field, getting aboard the ships and trying to call out those requirements and raise the condition of those ships that need it. And the second thing is to actually make structural changes within our processes and our procedures and those tools we use to better enable us to conduct the proper oversight.
Just talking to our chairman and his staff, I'm going to turn this back to the chairman about a request for a matrix on exactly what you're doing in timeframes.
Which you have, which you're going to give us, right?
I can do that for you, sir.
We've already asked you for it.
Okay.
So somebody's working on it. Anybody here working on it? Who would know when it would be given to us? Okay.
Well, let me just take it up here. If you have a system in place to improve the review and oversight, not only of the work that the Coast Guard is doing, but also of the various organizations to whom you have assigned responsibility, this committee would like to have that tracking system, that matrix, that reporting program, as to exactly how you are tracking the safety programs, and then an updated report I don't know, 6 months from now as to how it's going. Can you do that?
Yes, sir.
Good, thank you. For the NTSB, with regard to the accident itself, your report, you have, I don't know, trying to add up the number of at least 20 or 30 different recommendations. Do you ever go back and follow up on your recommendations as to whether they're actually done?
Yes.
Mr. Curtis?
Yes, we do.
Mr. Winter?
We make these recommendations as safety recommendations to a variety of parties, but the majority in this case have gone to the Coast Guard. We send these recommendations off. We expect an acknowledgement of receipt, and then we track them from that point on. We have some expectations of how long it's going to take to get a response, but we constantly keep track of the recommendations until such time as they're closed, acceptable, in some cases closed, unacceptable, but we track them all the way through.
So your recommendations came out more than a month, almost 2 months ago now, the final version. Is that, I think that's the date. And have you had any success, or have you seen any improvement, any action on your recommendations yet? Some to the Coast Guard, some to the ship owners?
At this point in time, we would just expect to be getting an acknowledgement that they have the recommendation. At this point, we would hope that they would give us some idea of what their plan was and how long it was going to take.
It's our role here is one to, with regard to the Coast Guard, to make sure they're doing their task of maritime safety. And for the NTSB, your work to report to us, Mr. Curtis, I think this is your specific responsibility. What is your time frame on following up on the recommendations, both to the shipping industry as well as to the Coast Guard? What is, you have, we just asked the Coast Guard for their matrix for review, and I'm asking you for your matrix for review, your time frame, your schedule.
Yes, sir. So as you said, the recommendations would go out as of the adoption date shortly after, once they're forwarded to the parties, and they have 90 days to make their initial response to how they respond to the recommendation, what they would do. And TOTE has implemented some changes to those recommendations. There's about 10 recommendations to TOTE. But for all parties, whether they go to the Coast Guard, TOTE, other agencies, NOAA, some to NOAA, they have 90 days for the initial response, and then we have an Office of Safety Recommendations, which corresponds directly with them on an ongoing basis, and when they get a response back from those recipients of the recommendations, they are forwarded back, and for the marine-specific ones, back to our office to respond that we feel whether they're appropriate or not. And so we work through back to the Safety Recommendations Office and ultimately back to the recipient of the recommendation. So in this case, there were 53 recommendations, so we'll be very active and proactive in working with the Office of Safety Recommendations and the recipients.
It seems to me that the committee should be aware of this response loop that you just described. I would appreciate it if you could provide to the committee a continuous update on the progress by both the Coast Guard and the shipping industry in addressing the multiple recommendations that you have made. When might you be able to provide that update to us?
So we can provide that any time. I can work through our Office of Government Affairs to work with your folks to give you an update any period you specify. Certainly, we're available at any time to give those updates.
Okay. Do you have a specific time frame?
No.
I'm going to yield back at this point, but before I do, For me and my particular role here, the NTSB's recommendations and the response of both the Coast Guard and the shipping industry generally, or written large, is really important. And so I would appreciate it if the NTSB, towards the middle of this coming year, like maybe June, report back to us on what progress has been made, what outreach you have done to NTSB with regard to the recommendations that you have made. They're of no value unless somebody follows up on them, so I would appreciate it, Mr. Curtis and Mr. Winter, if you would do that. And similarly, the Coast Guard with regard to all of the recommendations and updating both with regard to the recommendations as well as with regard to the improvements on the oversight of the various organizations that do the safety reviews. And with that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Quick question. Does every ship being built now have an indicator for the hatch being closed, the hatches around the ship? If they're below a certain, I don't know.
There are standards in place for newer ships that are being built. Yes, sir.
So that's in effect now. So all big ships being built, cargo ships, have a little light with all the hatches that says if they're closed or open.
They have indicators as well as there's flooding detection in the hold spaces to alert them if there's water coming into that space. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'd like to yield to the Ranking Member, which we're honored to have here with us.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Well, I've read a lot about this, and I really don't like systems that foster preventable tragedies that take 33 lives. Admiral, the Coast Guard subsequently looked at the sister ship, El Yunque. What was the condition of that ship?
It was in substandard condition.
And so we can assume that that El Faro was, as the sister ship, in similar substandard condition.
The Marine Board, the Coast Guard's Marine Board certainly made that same conclusion, sir.
Okay. And what did was this boat certified by ABS?
Yes.
And what did they say about the boat? Did they note deficiencies? How recent was their inspection? Isn't it annual?
Yes, they would be on there every year, as would the Coast Guard. I don't know when the last survey had been. I don't recall on the Yunque when the last survey was. But certainly we found things that should have been captured in the course of the normal routine of surveys and Coast Guard inspections.
So things were omitted. Now, when's the last time that you're aware that one of these alternative compliance folks told a company they had to take a ship out of service and make very significant repairs or just retire it, as they did El Yunque once you looked at it?
I'm aware of others that have been in similar condition that have had to come out of service, but I'd say probably it's not frequent. It's not frequent.
Right. I mean, it's a competitive industry, right? And so I hire you. I'm hiring you to certify my rust bucket. I'd rather not hear about it. Or you tell me about it, and then I'm probably not going to hire you again, right? I mean, if they aren't being adequately overseen. What's the liability of the classification people in this case? Is there potential liability for them? Are they being sued because they overlooked things?
That's a little bit outside my area of expertise regarding the liability. I can reassure you that certainly we recognize the importance of proper oversight over all classification societies, all third parties that we entrust to do our work to help us. And we are committed again to trying to rectify that.
Do you feel there's any conflict in your mission here where you're both to facilitate and promote seaborne commerce, and at the same time you're supposed to protect the life and safety of the mariners? Many years ago, I offered an amendment in this committee where the FAA had that dual mandate, and I asked, is that a problem? And they said no. Then we had a tragic, totally preventable airplane crash, and after that came out, somehow my amendment got into the bill without having been passed on either side of the hill, because people realized that this was a horrible problem for the FAA to be both promoting an industry which is very mature and didn't need promotion and regulating safety, and I substantially took away the promotional aspects. Should we be moving the promotional aspects or mandate over to commerce? It seems a more logical place than Coast Guard.
I don't know that I find my role as promotion. I think that we balance, we try and be practical and apply common sense when we apply the standards that are either developed by Congress or that industries ask for. I think we rely more on the safety side of things, and we try and ensure that there's a level playing field out there, that we equally apply the regulations. And I would offer also, sir, that we're not the only flag in the world, the only country in the world that relies on third parties. Virtually every flag state out there today relies on these classification societies in some way, shape, or form. It's just the way the system has evolved. But we need proper oversight in order to ensure that all parties are doing what they're responsible for doing.
Yeah, I mean, and what would constitute proper oversight? I mean, in this case, let's just say, had the Coast Guard had adequate staff, El Faro was surveyed, deficiencies were not noted, and if you had followed on with a comprehensive inspection and found deficiencies that weren't noted, what would be the consequences for that classification society?
Well, first off, we would have made sure that the ship is in proper condition and does not have the problems that were found. Secondly, would be to have a scheme in place to make sure that we do hold those class societies accountable. So it starts at the basic level, getting on board the ship to observe the standards on board the ship to see if they're meeting the minimum standards. Secondly, it's digging into the safety management system aboard the ship and aboard that company that they have to make sure that they have the proper systems in place to maintain the ship. And then thirdly, it's looking at the quality system in place by those third parties to make sure that they have the proper training, the proper procedures in place to make sure they capture and resolve these things when they find them.
Is there any way to assess a penalty against a classification society that does an inadequate survey that endangers life and safety, or to suspend their capability to do alternate compliance?
I don't know that we would pursue the penalty. I think probably the larger ramifications would be either preventing them from doing that work on our behalf. They all have a reputation they're trying to uphold. It is a competitive business, and they're generally pretty responsive when we ask them to be. We need to make sure that we're on them, holding them accountable, and ensuring they take the proper response.
I mean, it just all reminds me a little bit of, the junk bonds on Wall Street that caused the worst economic collapse since the Great Depression, where all of these bonds were given very high ratings because it was well known if you didn't give this junk high ratings, they wouldn't hire you to give the junk high ratings, and you lose business. I don't see how it's any different here.
Sir, I'd say here the difference is we know how to do this work. I've asked myself over and over again, how did this happen? We learned this lesson, yes, with the Marine Electric. Since then, we have doubled down time and time again, investing more and more in third parties, whether it's through Congress, certainly industry asking us to push more and more to the third parties. And we've gone through changes in the Coast Guard, where we stood up sectors. We used to have marine safety offices working for District M captains. Now we have sectors which are very powerful, allow us to do things we could never do before, like we saw this summer in response to the hurricanes. But along the way, I think we've lost a little bit of our focus, and we're doubling down now to get that back.
And you've got adequate resources to do that?
As always, you could do more if you had more, but this is not strictly a capacity problem. There are elements to training. If you just gave me another 1,000 Marine inspectors, it wouldn't solve this problem. This problem involves training. This problem involves getting the right information. This problem involves getting the right policy and procedures in place. Entry-level Marine inspections is not what I'm talking about. I need to have a small core, it's not a lot, a small core of people that can get out and are highly trained and proficient and stay focused on this area until we get it right.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the ranking member. Does anybody else have any questions for this panel? Any of my Republican colleagues? I'll take that as a no. Hey, thank you very much for being here and talking with us on this. And with that, we will move on to the next panel.
Mr. Chairman,
Please.
before we move on, we have a series of questions that we'd like to submit for the record. Many of these have already been discussed here. Let me just review very quickly and make sure that we cover what we want to cover. I want to specifically ask Admiral Nadeau, the recommendations from the NTSB, numerous as they are, I'm just going through them, I think there's about 20 or 30 of them. Have you responded to those recommendations? Those that are, almost all of them are specific to the Coast Guard.
Thank you for that question. We look forward to getting the entire report so we can go through them. We have seen the recommendations that were published, I guess a summary notice when the hearing was held. And looking at those, I can already tell they're very close to the recommendations we made in our own Marine Board of Investigation, our own report. We had 36 recommendations. Many of those are very, very similar to what is coming from the NTSB. So yes, I think that we will respond. We have a process in place to provide them feedback on each one of those, and we'll carefully assess their information, the report, and each recommendation.
When will you have your initial review and response to the recommendations?
As soon as we get the report, as soon as the report is published, we'll begin our review. And as I indicated, I think there's a timeline that I don't know if it's laid out in our MOU, but there's a time frame we meet. I don't know if it's 30, 60, or 90 days. But we will certainly meet that and do our best to meet the timeline that's established in the procedures.
Mr. Curtis, when will it be finalized?
The report will be out mid-February, on the 15th, and the recommendation letters will be right around that time. But so
Is it a 90-day response cycle? Is that?
the 90-day response cycle will start right around mid-February, maybe a little earlier, but soon. But they have been released in the abstract of the report.
Okay. And presumably, I can't count, there are 53 specific recommendations. I lost count somewhere around 30. Okay. We'll be interested in hearing the response from the Coast Guard. Also, does the shipping company or companies also respond?
Yes, it's the same process for all recipients of NTSB recommendations, sir.
Well, we'll await that. Thank you very much. I yield back, and thank you. And I do have specific questions for the record.
Without objection, with the gentleman authority to submit questions for the record. So we're looking for, from the Coast Guard and from NTSB, the matrix that he's talking about earlier. I got those confused. He would like the types of ships, and correct me, Mr. Garamondi, if I'm wrong, the types of ships that are like the El Faro, that you've been looking at now, the same year range, I guess, that are out there. I think that's what he was asking for, not the matrix of recommendations and accomplishments, which is separate. So both of those things. But we'd like to see all of those ships that you're out there looking at now, saying these could be at risk. In closing, I drive a '97 Expedition, right? If you were to go through the checklist on my truck, there's probably a lot of stuff on it that is not correct, like the middle seatbelt in the back doesn't work, the airbag's out on the passenger side. But if I take my seatbelt off as a driver, and when it's pouring down rain and go driving on the freeway at 90 miles an hour and crash it, you can look to all those things that weren't up to code in my truck. But the reason that it crashed is because I drove it, and I died because I drove it without my seatbelt in pouring rain at 90 miles an hour. In the end, you can make all the recommendations you want to, but if you leave hatches open in high sea states and you drive into a hurricane, bad things could happen. And I think that at the end of this, that's what I'm kind of taking out of this is even if all the structural issues from the age of the ship and classifications and giving the ship approval to set sail, those are all good things. But if you drive at 90 miles an hour in an old truck with no seatbelt on in pouring rain, you might crash. All right. So with that, yes, sir. You have something to say, Adam? Closing statement. It's all yours.
Sir, I could see why you draw that conclusion, but I guess we looked a little further beyond this particular incident, caused us to look at other vessels in the fleet, and did cause us concern about their condition. It's almost like your same old car. You know, some of our fleet is almost 3 times older than the average fleet sailing around the world today. just like your old car, those are the ones likely to break down. Those are the ones that are more difficult to maintain and may not start when I go out, turn the key. Our fleet is older than the average fleet. That presents some challenges. And some of our fleet, particularly Military Sealift Command, where it is a ready reserve component that kind of sits idle for long periods of time, that presents new challenges for us, sir. That we're working very closely with partners at Military Sealift Command, Admiral Mewborn, as well as Marriott Admiral Busby, to make sure that we pay proper attention to that.
Thank you. Mr. Garamendi is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for opening another avenue here that I had neglected. I know we're running up against the clock also. There's the ship and all of the adequacies or inadequacies of the ship itself. In this particular situation, as the chairman was saying, the driver on the freeway made a serious mistake. Are the men and women who are responsible for the safe operation of the ship, both from shore as well as on the ship itself, are they adequately trained? Are they, over a period of time, recertified? Are there questions that we should be raising about the adequacy of the men and women responsible for the ship itself? And is the Coast Guard also investigating that piece?
Yes, there were recommendations related to training, both with respect to weather forecasting, meteorology, and also with bridge resource management and other aspects that were highlighted here.
Okay. Obviously, we are not going to be able to question any of the personnel that were on the ship, but it appears that there were mistakes made in the operation of the ship, perhaps both from shore as well as from the ship itself while at sea. Does the NTSB or the Coast Guard have any concerns about the adequacy of training of the personnel that are on the American ships that are currently on the oceans? Do we have any recommendations for upgrade, for continuing classification, and for review of the of their ability to properly conduct the ship?
Excuse me, the NTSB has recommendations related to training and bridge resource management, both recurrent training as well as initial training for things like heavy weather, for advanced meteorology, for deck crews. So that aspect of training has also been included in their assessment, in our investigation.
My final point is that the ability and capability of the men and women in charge of running the ship has to be continually observed and with a high level of assurance that they are competent and capable. And in the NTSB report, among your 53 recommendations, there are several that speak to that issue. And I would expect that in the responses, both from the ship owner as well as from the Coast Guard, that this will be an issue that will be taken up in the responses. My concern goes beyond this particular company and the men and women that are hired to operate the ships for this company, but rather to the entire U.S. fleet and the adequacy of the training, the capability of the men and women that are responsible. So I'd like the Coast Guard to also pick that up when it pick up that issue beyond just this one company. Okay? With that, I'll yield back. Thank you.
Thank the ranking member. You know, just in closing. You had two Navy ships crash last year, and it wasn't any mechanical anything. It was they took away the last couple of years. They took away surface warfare officer training. It became on-the-job training with the DVD. Used to be a 6-month school up until, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago. They got rid of it. Training saves a lot of lives, right? And looking through everything, it looks like this was poor decision making that exacerbated physical problems with the ship. And I think that's what we take out of this, and we'll keep drilling down. And if we could get those matrices of the ships, right, that you're looking at, so we can kind of see what's out there right now, and then the recommendations and what's actually been accomplished with those 52, the commandant said, let's go with it. 2 out of the 3, the admin recommendations, he said, let's go with it. We'd like to see what actions you're taking that match those recommendations. And I think June 1st, is that too long? Could you get them before that? We can get the ship matrix before that, probably. But as soon as you have it, we'd like to see it. Okay. June 1st is good. June 1st is good with the ranking member, so it's good with me. And with that, thank you all very much, and we'll go on to the next panel. I was going to go. Lady and gentlemen, thanks for being here. We'll move on to the second panel. We'll hear from Rear Admiral Erica Schwartz, Director of Health, Safety, and Work Life with the United States Coast Guard, Rear Admiral Michael Haycock, Assistant Commandant for Acquisition and Chief Acquisition Officer with the United States Coast Guard, and Mr. David Powner. I say it right? Powner? Which way?
Powner.
Mr. David Powner, Director of Information Technology Management Issues with the Government Accountability Office. Admiral Schwartz, you're recognized.
Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garamendi, honorable members of the subcommittee, good morning and thank you very much for your oversight and for your continued strong support of the United States Coast Guard. I'm honored to testify before you today with my colleague, Rear Admiral Haycock. Let me state now, bottom line up front, we sincerely regret what happened with the Integrated Health Information System, or IHIS. The Coast Guard attempted to develop an electronic health record that was ultimately unsuccessful. What began as a project to develop a simple electronic health record increased in scope and expanded into a much larger concept, which added work-life and safety services. While well-intentioned, this project lacked appropriate oversight and governance and resulted in a project that had significant mission creep, untimely delays, and increased cost. Upon realizing that IHIS was not going to be completed in a reasonable time at a reasonable cost, the Coast Guard made the decision to cancel IHIS. We are incorporating lessons learned as we move forward with our new electronic health record. Recognizing the criticality of the new electronic health record, it has been formally designated as an acquisition with the necessary and appropriate level of governance and oversight that IHIS lacked. As the program sponsor representative, it is my highest priority to work alongside the Chief Acquisition Officer, the Chief Information Officer, and other members on the governance board to leverage lessons learned and to ensure that the best choice that meets service requirements is acquired and implemented as soon as possible. Since our outdated electronic health record had significant IT security concerns, we continued with just paper health records. As a physician, I know firsthand the risk of managing a medical program based on paper health records. Whether it's the challenges of scheduling an appointment, difficulty in reading handwritten clinical notes, storing volumes of information, or decreased productivity, the Coast Guard cannot continue without an electronic health record system long-term. Our clinics and sick bays are managing with the paper health record system, but this is not a permanent solution. We must have an electronic health record system that is interoperable with the DoD and one that allows our members to efficiently transition to the VA. As the Coast Guard's Chief Medical Officer, I oversee the healthcare delivery and medical services for more than 48,000 members of the nation's 5th Armed Service. I have a passion for ensuring the Coast Guard has superior access to healthcare. It is my duty and responsibility to ensure that our healthcare system is able to serve our greatest asset, our people. As we continue to pursue the very best electronic health record solution for our members, the Coast Guard is thankful for your interest and assistance on this important issue. Supported by sustained internal governance and your continued support, I'm confident that the Coast Guard will implement the finest electronic health record solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral. Admiral, you're recognized.
Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garamendi, good morning. First, I'd like to thank you for your continued support of the Coast Guard and the guidance that you provide to our military service. As my colleague has mentioned, the Coast Guard recognizes the critical need to move to an electronic health record system. And as a Chief Acquisition Officer, I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the improvements that we've made over the last several years to apply disciplined governance to these types of investments throughout our service. As you're well aware, over the last 15 years or so, with the tremendous assistance of this subcommittee, the Coast Guard has undertaken significant efforts to improve the oversight and the management of our major acquisitions, such as our vessels and our aircraft. Our acquisition framework is designed to constrain and validate requirements to provide checks and balances and provide continuous and effective oversight at all stages of the acquisition lifecycle. Until recently, we did not use the same level of rigor to govern key decisions for our smaller investments. We've learned several lessons from our experience with the Integrated Health Information System. The most important of these lessons are related to oversight and program management. Without the oversight and guidance normally provided to our formal acquisition programs, well-meaning people were overcome by the task at hand, and the programs simply outgrew their capabilities. And as a result, we have made significant process improvements to manage all sizes of acquisitions, including non-major acquisitions. To that end, the Coast Guard overhauled its processes for non-major programs. We established formal roles and responsibilities and requirements in the same manner that we use for major acquisition programs. These new processes established a governance framework and provided a roadmap for improving program execution and managing risk. This framework leverages the expertise of our technical authorities, including the Chief Information Officer, to ensure that non-major programs remain on track and key decisions represent the priorities of all communities across the Coast Guard. Additionally, we recently instituted new processes to identify candidates for formal acquisition management and oversight, which allows us to look out for those investments like IHIS to prevent them from falling through the cracks. We created an Oversight Council specifically to provide oversight and governance for non-major programs. This provides senior staff from across the service a forum to regularly assess performance, raise issues, and address concerns, and it also ensures we have people with the right talents and skills managing our programs. Recognizing the continued urgent need to address our healthcare record system, in 2016, the Coast Guard established a formal non-major acquisition program to modernize the management of healthcare acquisition for approximately 50,000 active duty and reserve members and improve the exchange of healthcare information with the Department of Defense, the Department of Veteran Affairs, and commercial care providers. We initiate activities to explore several possible alternatives and are in close contact with DoD and VA to ensure the new solution is interoperable with their healthcare record systems. Last year, we initiated market research to gather data on cost, schedule, and performance capabilities of potential solutions currently available in the commercial marketplace. We're evaluating the benefits and the risks associated with several approaches and are developing the best procurement strategy to expedite the acquisition. The Coast Guard recognizes the urgency to support the health of our most valuable asset, our people, and our current governance framework ensures that we have the processes and policies in place to oversee our current electronic healthcare acquisition program. We continue to incorporate the recommendations made as a result of the invaluable oversight of this subcommittee and the GAO, and I'm committed, along with Admiral Schwartz, to the expeditious and responsible delivery of a high-quality electronic health record solution for our men and women in the field. Thank you again for the subcommittee's staunch support and your oversight of Coast Guard programs and for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Admiral Haycock. Now to Mr. Powner. You're recognized.
Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garamendi, thank you for inviting GAO to testify on the Coast Guard's failed effort to acquire an electronic health record. This morning, I will provide details of what went wrong with the acquisition and what needs to be done to manage this more appropriately in the future. This look back is important to make sure that the Coast Guard corrects the management and governance flaws that led to about $60 million being wasted. This effort started in September 2010 and was to be a 5-year project and cost about $14 million. Due to growing scope and mismanagement, the cost grew to about $60 million before the project was terminated in October 2015 with nothing to show for it. There's a long list of things that went wrong that are laid out in great detail in the report we are releasing today. The highlights are: the project was behind schedule. There were questions about whether the Coast Guard was using appropriate funding sources to pay for it. Expected system capabilities were not being delivered. The system had limited security features, which is alarming given the sensitivity of the data residing in these electronic health records. The Coast Guard wasn't completely following its own processes to acquire a system. Examples include not involving users of the system and not testing it adequately. Executives who should have been involved were not, as several governance boards were established to oversee this, and they were simply not active. I'd like to highlight the words "not active." We at GAO have reported on failed IT acquisitions over the years, and the message is usually that executive boards were not effective or not involved enough, not active. Finally, post-cancellation, no equipment or software was delivered for reuse, and the Coast Guard continued to pay millions to vendors after the cancellation to satisfy contractual commitments. In fact, our report highlights 2 payments scheduled for next month that collectively total more than $5 million. Yes, nearly 2.5 years after cancellation, we are still paying contractors. Compounding the situation is the fact that 3 months after the October 2015 cancellation, the Coast Guard decommissioned its older existing legacy system because it was not compliant with international medical coding requirements. This left the Coast Guard to predominantly use a paper process to maintain health records. To its credit, the Coast Guard is attempting to use some DoD applications and workarounds to supplement its paper process, but let's be clear, using paper is inefficient and dangerous. Coast Guard clinical staff reported major issues to us that include problems with incomplete records, issues with tracking medications, and challenges scheduling appointments. The Coast Guard is planning a new electronic health record, A request for information went out in April 2017, but the Coast Guard is yet to determine its specific electronic health record solution. Moving forward, we have 5 recommendations for the Coast Guard. Number 1, make sure managers and executives with the right IT background are involved with this acquisition. Most importantly, this includes the Chief Information Officer. Number 2, executive governance needs to be active and frequent. This governance needs to be driven by the CIO and the witnesses here today. Number 3, project management disciplines need to be carried out. This would include implementing the appropriate cybersecurity measures and involving the user community extensively, since business process change will be significant to effectively deploy commercial products in this area. Number 4, the Coast Guard needs to consider adjustments or tailoring of its processes it uses to manage what it calls smaller or non-major acquisitions. Dollar thresholds alone shouldn't drive the rigor and attention projects get. Mission criticality should. And finally, the Coast Guard needs to strongly consider the EHR solution that DoD and VA are pursuing. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement. Thank you for your oversight of this important acquisition.
Thank you, Mr. Pounder, and to the other witnesses, thank you very much. I guess let's just go with what you were saying. What was your last recommendation?
The last recommendation is you really need to look at what DoD and VA are doing. I mean, we made a bold decision for VA to go with the solution that DoD was using, and I understand competition in this industry.
But is the Coast Guard DoD?
Well,
the Coast Guard's a military service, right? Why wouldn't you go with DoD in the first place? Why not be interchangeable with DoD? Why not save all that money and time and be efficient and use DoD's product? Admirals.
The Coast Guard is looking with great interest at what DoD is doing and what the VA is doing with regards to their new electronic health record system.
But why would you not use that?
So, sir, as a military service, we certainly are looking at what they are doing with respect to the new MHS Genesis product. And what we are doing is looking at what their lessons learned
Why would
are.
you not use that? Why would you not use what DoD is already doing?
As part of the acquisition process, which I will yield to my colleague here, we are looking at various GOTS and COTS solutions.
I understand that you're doing that. Why would you not use DoD's solution?
Mr. Chairman, I can't speak to something that happened that long ago.
No, now. Why would you not use DoD's solution now?
That's our
You're wasting money and time going to look at stuff when it exists right now. With the other, and I don't think you'd say that the Navy is less complicated than the Coast Guard, right? Or the Army. It's a lot more complicated and larger and more spread out, and they're able to do it. So why wouldn't you just use that?
As you know, Mr. Chairman, when you start getting into major acquisitions of great scope and complexity, there's discipline that we have to put into the process, and that's what prevents us from getting in trouble. We're going through that process. We've done an analysis of alternatives, which is looking at what exists out there, for us to potential solutions. One of those solutions is using a federal service provider. That is the solution that we would like to go for, and that's what we're working with the VA and DoD to make happen. We are in close conversation with them informally on probably a weekly basis, and meeting with them formally on a monthly basis. We've been invited to be part of their executive steering group, and we're participating in that. So we're tracking down that direction, but we need to follow the discipline for the acquisition process, or we will end up in messes like other programs have seen in the past. We're not doing it. That's what gives me great confidence on EHRA going forward, is that we have stood it up as a formal acquisition program, and is getting that discipline and the oversight. The very same people that oversee all of our major acquisitions like ships and aircraft and such, they are providing the oversight for EHRA now, and that includes the Chief Information Officer and every stakeholder and tech authority in the Coast Guard.
Okay. I would highly encourage you guys to do what's easy and efficient and effective, especially when you got really big services with lots of money doing it for you, and you can just piggyback onto that. Let me switch over. There's no code. There's no software. There's no code and no machinery, right?
Sir, IHIS was considered a software as a service product, And so what we did was we contracted with various software companies, and they developed modules for our safety program, for our health program, for our work-life program. But because it's a software as a service, once we stop paying for those services, we don't have a final product to show.
So you didn't have any intellectual property?
That is correct, sir.
Whose decision was it to cancel it?
I guess it was probably 3/4 of the way through 2015, the Executive Oversight Committee, their council, was basically their council was sought out by the project. The executives on that team heard the brief, saw the risks involved, and recommended that the Coast Guard, the Vice Commandant, cancel the program.
I think it's very strange that there's nothing. That you got $60 million and you literally got nothing out of it. Is that usual, Mr. Pounder? I mean, do you to retain no intellectual property?
You know, I think you can write contracts in a way where you do maintain some of, I understand the software as a service concept, but you can write that in a way that you have some reusability. If you have nothing, that might even be more of a reason to go with what VA and DOD are already doing. Because if we don't have anything to reuse, I agree with you on your comment about piggybacking on what's already there. And they're ahead of the game, so you could look at lessons learned and learn from that. That's what VA is doing with DOD right now. And there are lessons learned on the business processes and the like. To me, that makes sense to go that route, especially given the fact that we have nothing.
I guess my last question, just to stress this point, is there anything that's separate that makes Coast Guardsmen different from any other service member besides what they do and their specialty? Is there anything special about being in the Coast Guard that would not allow you to be in the Department of Defense's health record system?
No, Mr. Chairman. We're a military service, so our active duty Coast Guardsmen are just like all the other active duty military. I think some things that may play into it that make us a little unique is the size of our service. So infrastructure is a little bit different. The types of patients that we see and that the VA sees might be a little bit different, but for the most part, there's nothing special there.
The Coast Guard's got a lot of missions that do a lot of totally different things, and I think what you're doing is complicating your own lives here. Really. I mean, you can't have a core competency of everything. Right. With that, I'd like to yield to the ranking member. You recognize Mr. Garamendi.
I think I've been through too many of these. Electronic health records are now standard in every health system, virtually every health system in the nation. And every one of them have made mistakes. And in most every systems, the first effort failed. But we have more than enough models in place so that this should not have happened. But it did. My real issue is who was the contractor? I was looking through the report and never a name of the contractor.
Sir, there were numerous contractors that supported the IHIS effort.
Who are they?
Sir, I don't have a list of the contractors with me today, but we certainly can make that list available to you.
You know, somebody ought to be held accountable here. We're holding the Coast Guard accountable, but the contractor also screwed up. I want to know who screwed up. Who's the contractor that screwed up here? Mr. Pounder, do you know?
I can get you a list of the contractors who were involved in that.
I'm sorry. This whistling behind just wiped you out. Could you say that?
Yeah, we can get you a list of the contractors who are involved. I think you bring up a good point. You know, I've testified in front of Congress on many failed acquisitions over the years. And is there mismanagement on the government side? Yes, but there is also an obligation on the contractual side to work in partnership on this. And we need more of that going forward, clearly.
Yeah. I'm just willing to bet without knowing who they are. I'll bet they've screwed up before. I'll bet we've hired the same folks that screwed up before to do another screw up. Yes, I would like to know the name of the companies that failed to perform. That's the first issue. The second issue was the question raised by the chairman, Mr. Hunter, and that is the Department of Defense is in the process of developing an electronic medical record, and if I recall correctly, they finally decided, out of a fit of wisdom, that it would also be the same records that the VA used. In other words, they were transferable one to another. That took about 10 years fight between the two agencies. But I guess somewhere along the line, both decided that an active member and reservist in the military, the Department of Defense, might at some time in the future become a veteran, and that their medical records really ought to be available to the Veterans Administration. Does the Coast Guard also see the wisdom of this transferability of the medical records from the Coast Guard to the VA? Are you taking that into account?
Absolutely, sir. And just to be clear, right now, even though we're on paper health records, we do transfer our paper health records to the VA. It's through a system called the Health Artifacts Imaging Management System, which is the same system DoD uses right now. We digitize our paper health records when a member leaves the service, and that record is uploaded into HAMES, and the VA can extract the record from HAMES.
Okay. So, at least you're thinking about it with regard to paper. And you're going to do that with regard to the electronics if and when you ever get there?
Absolutely, sir.
Or the chairman was pushing the point, I think correctly, that you ought to be using the same system as the Department of Defense. Are you contemplating doing that? It wasn't quite clear to me in the responses, admirals, that you are or are not.
The alternatives analysis has
Please, really speak loud. This whistling behind is most distracting.
so the alternatives analysis that we conducted, that is one of the preferred alternatives, and we are working through the details to make that happen.
And when do you expect to make a decision?
We are approaching acquisition decision event 2A, 2B, which probably doesn't mean much to you, but we have a major acquisition decision coming up here probably end of February.
I know of several clinics in California that have more than 50,000 lives in their clinics. They've established electronic medical records. I mean, some of this stuff is now off the shelf. Mr. Pounder, you've been at this a long time. Mm-hmm. You've found more than enough problems. Your recommendations in your report are rather general. Do you have specific recommendations, and is one of those recommendations?
Yeah, I would say the key recommendation, and I've seen this, you could have the best project management on these technology projects, but if you don't have executives that are accountable and breathing down the neck of project managers, that's what makes this stuff work. When you get executives involved, I do like example, Census Bureau. Okay, now we're going to spend $3 billion more on the Census Bureau. What happens? Secretary Ross is now involved with the Census Bureau, and they set up adequate governance. The Coast Guard has a governance process in their policies. They just need to execute it. And starts with the admirals at this table, with the CIO, with the CFO, and they need to drive the delivery of this system. Good governance, that's what actually works in government, when you have the executives accountable and pushing hard to make sure we get deliveries, not only from the government, but from contractors too. You sit down with contractors, you demand the A-team. That's the stuff that's worked over the years, and I can give you positive examples too where it has worked.
I agree entirely. So, admirals, are you engaged?
Yes, Congressman. IHIS was a kind of a watershed event, shook our foundations. It really caused us to kind of sit back on our heels and try to figure out what happened. IHIS did not have the appropriate executive oversight, and that is probably the biggest problem. There's other things that complicate IHIS, but they all lead to this failed oversight on our part. So we have stood up a formal acquisition program for EHRA, and it has the right executives on providing the oversight. Admiral Schwartz is a member of the EOC, the Executive Oversight Committee. Our CIO is, and a host of others that have a stake in this. So I assure you, we have the right executives breathing down the neck.
Well, you just described everybody's responsible, and therefore nobody's responsible. So which of the two of you are responsible?
I am responsible because I'm the acquisition officer.
Admiral Schwartz?
Sir, I'm responsible for ensuring the requirements document is delivered to our acquisition officer to delineate what we need and what we want for an electronic health record system.
Isn't that readily available from a dozen different organizations that already have electronic medical records?
We have completed the operational requirements document. We delivered it to the hands of our chief acquisition officer, and we're moving as quickly as we can to get this EHR out in the field.
Have you consulted with Mr. Bonner on his recommendations?
Sir, we have read the GAO's draft report, and we have taken them absolutely to heart. As Admiral Haycock mentioned, governance was a significant issue with IHIS. IHIS was stovepiped in the medical program. We did not involve the chief information officer. We did not involve the chief acquisition officer. No more. As we move forward, we have this cross-directorate governance that includes the CIO, that includes the chief acquisition officer, and others on the governance board.
You've developed an AOA?
An alternatives analysis.
Yes.
Congressman.
Have you developed one?
We have.
Have you presented that to the committee? Us?
I don't.
Well, why don't you do so? We've seen AOAs on God knows how many things on the defense, on the House Armed Services Committee. I'd love to see your AOA. Mr. Pounder, have you reviewed the AOAs?
No, I have not reviewed that in great detail.
Should you?
Yes, but I would say you could eliminate the AOAs down to, this was mentioned here, this is a robust area when you look at commercial products. So I don't know why we would look at anything beyond commercial products, and then I'll narrow it further. That's piggyback on DOD and VA. Let's make it simple. We're making it too complicated. I understand we have to follow
Admiral
process.
Schwartz, you heard what he said?
Sir, as the chief medical officer, I absolutely would love to go with DOD and the VA. I have provided my requirements. We worked very closely to look at what DOD was doing to ensure that the operational requirements document that we provided to the acquisition officer was very similar to what the DOD system is.
I find it astounding that, I mean, this is not complicated. There are commercial applications out there. I know 4 clinics that in the last 3 years have purchased off-the-shelf electronic medical records that also allow them the opportunity to convert their previous paper records to electronic records. All done. It's off the shelf. And they have more lives than the Coast Guard has. I guess one question is that the GAO comes in after there's a screw-up. It seems to me that there ought to be an iterative process here. Mr. Pounder, you've got a lot more knowledge than either of the 2 admirals here about these kinds of things. This has been your life, at least your more recent life's work. Maybe you ought to quit GAO and become a consultant. But stay where you are. We need you there. But it would seem to me that it would be worthwhile for the Coast Guard to consult with the GAO and to learn from their experiences. I know you have 2 different tasks.
Yeah, if I can add, so, you know, we do some postmortems at GAO on things that go wrong, but we do a lot of work for the Congress when acquisitions are in flight, and that's when it's most effective. Working alongside, we can still maintain our independence and work alongside while acquisitions are in flight to ensure that governance and project management, contractor oversight, and all those things are occurring.
Well, given that, I've just requested an AOA or the AOA. I would appreciate your review of the AOA while it's in process. Postmortems are usually over dead and troubled projects. And we can avoid that, I think, by working together here. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. One thing we looked at, and I don't know if you've heard of this, Mr. Powner, but it's called the Distributed Common Ground System, DCIGS for the Army. It's like $4 billion they put into it. Never worked. They had about 30 nice contractors that all did modules, and they could all plug and play theoretically, but nothing, it didn't work, period. And it was billions of dollars, and it required the Chief of Staff of the Army now, General Milley, to kind of do what you're doing, Admiral Haycock, and taking a hard look at this as a four-star. Because when you're spending billions of dollars or tens of millions of dollars for the Coast Guard, I mean, you got to make sure you got it right, especially with software. All right? It'd be nice to be a software contractor in town here.
I want to know who the contractor was.
I can do stuff for you and never give it to you, and you'll pay me. I think it's absurd you're paying next month for this, even though the whole thing's over. But what's in the past is in the past. We don't want to beat on the Coast Guard too much right now. You got things straightened up, and hopefully moving forward, Mr. Powner will have good things to say. And again, I'm of the mind to make you get on DOD's thing, no matter what you think. We ought to just tell you to do it. You don't need to be going off and doing your own thing when it comes to health care. And I think that's not Mr. Garamendi and I or this committee micromanaging. It's saying you guys don't get to go off on your own and think that just use taxpayer dollars because it's fun when you have the Department of Defense doing it. So I think that's something we had to look at, is just telling you what to do, especially in this case. I think that'd be a smart thing for us to look at and see if that's even possible. With that, thank you very much for being here, and hopefully we get this straight. With that, the hearing's adjourned.
I am not sure